Hi, it's me, the storyteller. Thank you for joining me. Most of my stories on this channel are based on actual events, and some aren't. I'll let you decide if this story is fiction, or if it's not. By the time Detective Lena Voss arrived, the morning fog had thickened to a dull gray wall that swallowed the shore. Yellow tape fluttered in slow motion, and the air smelled of salt and wet kelp. She ducked between the tape without asking. A young deputy stepped forward, hand out instinctively. He tried to stop her from going any further, but she pushed past him with barely a glance, eyes fixed on the beached rowboat. The boat was grounded in the shallows, half covered in seaweed and barnacle clumps. The body inside had been arranged, or preserved, dried. Mouth packed with coarse salt, and circling the base of the hull, a perfect ring of barnacles, suctioned in place like a seal. Sergeant Baker stood nearby, his coat damp at his shoulders, jaw clenched like he hadn't moved in an hour. He didn't say Lena's name. He didn't need to. She already knew. It was her mother, Marla Voss. Lena made to step closer, but Baker raised his hand. Not stern, gentle, almost uncertain. A moment passed, thick with the sound of waves. Then he nodded low and resigned. He didn't try to stop her again. She walked slowly to the edge of the tide, eyes on the barnacles, her face unreadable. No one else said a word. As Lena stood there, staring down at the body, something caught her eye. Her mother's neck, where, tucked beneath the collar of her coat, was a small gold locket. Lena had never seen it before. Had her mother always worn it? The chain seemed delicate, worn with time, and something about it felt out of place. She hadn't remembered her mother wearing jewelry, at least not like this. The locket looked almost new. Who had given it to her? The question lingered in Lena's mind. She had never seen her mother wear anything like this before. Had it been a gift? A keepsake? Or had it been something she had kept hidden away? Lena's fingers itched to touch it, but she resisted. It wasn't the right time. Instead, she stared at the locket, feeling a vague sense of discomfort, like it had suddenly appeared where it didn't belong. Maybe it was just another thing she hadn't noticed over the years. Or maybe it had been here all along, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed now, when everything else around her was falling apart. Later, back at the station, Baker told her she was too close to the case. It was policy. But he also didn't stop her. He knew. He'd worked with her long enough to understand that this was the only way forward. The case was hers, and she'd take it. Funeral first, then questions, then answers, if they dared to surface. It rained during the burial, a steady drizzle that turned the cemetery's clay soil to slick rusted-colored mud. The service was brief, closed casket, sparse attendance, a few neighbors, an old friend from church, no extended family, no eulogy, no one to give it. Lena stood beside the grave, hands in her pockets, the collar of her coat turned up against the wind. Her mother had always hated the rain, something about how it soaked into the bones and lingered for days. Lena watched the casket lower without blinking, her mind drifting back to a time when things had been different. They had been close once, her mother and her. She could almost hear her mother's laugh, a sound that now felt so far away, like a memory from another life. But that had been years ago. The distance between them had grown over time. Lena had allowed her career to take precedence, chasing cases, pulling long hours, and leaving behind the one person who had always been there for her. Now, standing at the grave, she realized how much time had passed without her truly noticing the rift forming. It hurt more than she expected. These past years, she'd been selfish. She recognized that. She could feel the wetness of the rain, but it wasn't the cold that numbed her. It was regret. Regret that she hadn't been there enough for her mother. Regret that the last time they had spoken, it had been in anger, an argument over nothing important. But Lena's training had taught her to compartmentalize, to put aside her emotions when duty called. It had made her good at her job, but now, standing in the cemetery, she had felt the weight of her heart that had hardened over the years. She felt the loss, deeply, but didn't allow herself the luxury of mourning it. Sergeant Baker stood at a respectable distance under a black umbrella. He hadn't said much since the crime scene, and he didn't now. Later, back at her mother's house, the silence was worse. Not empty, hollow. Everything exactly as Marla had left it. Teacup in the sink, a book face down on the arm of the chair. Lena moved through it all like she was trespassing in a life she hadn't finished learning. She felt the regret again, blocked it out. In the bedroom, she found the locket, cleaned and placed neatly on the nightstand by someone from the coroner's office. She picked it up, thumbed the clasp open. Inside were 2 small photographs. One was of Lena as a child, around 6, smiling, hand reaching for someone just outside the frame. The other, a man. No name, no date. Face unfamiliar. Mid-30s, stern, unsmiling. She didn't recognize him, and yet something about the photo chilled her, like déjà vu reaching out from behind glass. She studied the face again. Sharp lines, unaged. And then something clicked, something she couldn't explain. Her mother had once told her a bedtime story about a man lost at sea. Not a sailor, a keeper of things below the water, a figure who always came back, but never quite the same. Lena slid the photo into her pocket. Something had returned. The next morning, Lena returned to the station, not to file anything, not officially. She didn't check in with Baker. She just moved down the hallway, past the bullpens, and into the archives like she'd done 100 times before. Only this time, she wasn't after a case file. She was looking for something personal. The photo she'd found in her mother's locket had kept her awake most of the night. The man's face kept appearing in her mind. Not a memory, but in suggestion. Like a shadow that had followed her through childhood, just outside the periphery. She remembered her mother's voice, telling her stories by the window when it stormed. There was a man who lived below the sea. The tide took him, but he never came back. Marla had never said it was Lena's father. Never named him. Never even hinted, but Lena knew now. Somehow. There was a gap in her life she never filled. Just flashes, brine in her nose, a storm lamp on a boat, the feel of strong arms lifting her once before vanishing forever. At the records room, she started with death certificates. She searched Voss. Nothing local. No death on file. Nothing in the coroner's books. No obituaries. Not even a missing persons report. Officially, her father had never existed. She went deeper. Fishing licenses, property records, municipal employee lists, and then she found it. A coastal township registry from 1989. Her mother had lived in a small rental near the jetty that year, listed as next of kin, E. Voss. No first name, no birth date. She printed it, stared at the paper like it might rearrange itself into something she could understand. She pulled the photo from her pocket again. Same face, same man. Unaged. Unreal. She checked the timestamp on the registry. He had been listed alive 2 years after he supposedly died. Sergeant Baker was in his office, the door cracked just enough to catch her shadow. He didn't look up right away, just finished scribbling something in his notebook. He told her she wasn't technically on this case. She stepped in anyway. He didn't stop her. Baker worked with Lena for years. He knew when she was chasing smoke and when she was chasing something real. This was the latter. She placed a printed record on his desk without a word. The 1989 Township Registry. He glanced at it, read the name, and let out the smallest breath through his nose. Not quite surprised, not quite denial. She asked him if her father had ever been on their radar, if his name had ever come up. Baker didn't lie, but he didn't say much. Said there'd been a case, decades back, before Lena had even joined the force. Off the books. One of those things people decided not to talk about. She asked for the file. He didn't have it, but he told her where to start. She found the report in the basement, filed under a different name, buried under 3 unrelated incidents, dated 1965. Victim, Judith Vale, found in a beached boat near the very same inlet, mouth full of salt, body dried, ring of barnacles arranged in a perfect circle. Judith had been 34, married, no children. Except there was a handwritten note scrawled on the back of the photo, survived by sister Meredith Vale. Meredith Vale lived inland, about an hour from the coast. Lena found her with the help of a social worker who'd visited the woman years earlier. The house smelled of dried flowers and old books. Meredith was in her late 80s, sharp but a little slow. Her hands trembled when Lena showed her the photo. She nodded, confirming it was Judith. She said that was the year she stopped being Judith. Lena asked her what she meant. She said she came back, but she wasn't right. Kept talking about the sea, said she could hear it whisper her name, even in her sleep. Lena asked about the husband. Meredith's mouth tightened. Said something about he was going to help her. Said he knew how to stop it from spreading. Then one night he was gone. So was Judith. A week later, the boat washed up. Meredith was told to stop asking questions for her safety. He told her they didn't want the rest of them to remember. Then Lena asked for his name. Meredith closed her eyes and then whispered, Elias. It was late when Lena returned to her mother's home. The street was quiet, the sky overcast and moonless. The ocean could be heard in the distance, a low, restless hush against the shore. Inside, the house still smelled like her mother. Lavender, old fabric, and a faint trace of salt water that hadn't been there before. She moved through the rooms like she didn't belong in them anymore. In the kitchen, a tea kettle sat untouched on the stove. The clock on the wall had stopped sometime after her mother's death. In the hallway, picture frames hung slightly crooked, like something had passed through too quickly and upset the balance. She entered the bedroom again, this time with gloves, a flashlight, and the growing sense that she was no longer just grieving. She was investigating. She opened drawers, checked the closet, flipped through the pages of a tattered journal her mother had always kept locked away. Most of the entries were mundane. Grocery lists, half-remembered dreams. But near the back, Lena found a page half-torn and rewritten over several times. There were dates, 4 of them, spread decades apart. 1927, 1947, 1965, and 1986. And below the last one, the year 2024 had been started and scratched out. She ran her fingers across the page, heart thudding. In the attic, she found a trunk, locked, but the key was taped beneath a nearby beam, a habit her mother had kept for decades. Inside were newspaper clippings, old photos, and a man's coat folded with reverence. It matched the one the man had worn in the photo she found inside the locket. The same sharp lapels, the same storm-worn fabric. At the bottom of the trunk, there was another photo, grainy and dark. A woman in a rowboat, barely visible, salt crusting the frame. The timestamp matched the 1965 case Lena had uncovered just hours earlier. The photo had been kept, hidden, protected. Something creaked downstairs. Lena froze, listening. A step. Slow, deliberate. She moved toward the sound, flashlight off, instinct sharp. But when she reached the bottom of the stairs, the door was still locked. No one was there. The air felt different now, heavier. She stood in the silence for a long moment, watching shadows stretch across the floor. Then she backed out slowly, left the lights off, and slipped into the dark. The shoreline near Kiln Bay hadn't changed much in 60 years. The trees had grown taller, the beach more overgrown, but the old inlet still curved the same way around the rocks. The locals didn't come out this far anymore. No reason to. No fish, no access road, no marked trails. Lena parked at the gate, climbed over the rusted chain, and walked in with the tide at her back. She carried a copy of the 1965 report, photos curled and faded, corners brittle with age. The woman in the file, Judith Vale, had been found in a drifted skiff less than 100 feet from where Lena stood now. The barnacle ring, the desiccation, the salt, everything was nearly identical to her mother's case. What the file didn't include, but what Lena had found referenced in the margins, was a second body reported nearby weeks earlier. Unrelated, it said. Male, found dead in the woods above the beach. But the records ended there. No cause of death. No ID. No follow-up. She stood at the edge of the tree line and looked inland. The wind shifted. The forest smelled like rotten salt. She climbed the incline, brush catching at her sleeves, and followed what remained of an old footpath, a logging trail long since overtaken by moss and roots. At the top of the hill, the view opened out toward the sea, and in the middle of it, half buried beneath the ivy and soil, was the rotted frame of an overturned rowboat. She knelt beside it. Inside, a few barnacle fragments still clung to the wood. Not enough to be natural, just enough to make a pattern. She checked her file again. The report had noticed a missing boat, but never linked it to the male body or the later death. Someone had come here before Judith. Someone had started the pattern. As she scanned the area, her flashlight caught a weather-worn marker, a flat stone set into the ground. It wasn't a grave, but it had been placed there deliberately. There were initials carved into the surface. They'd been scratched out, then redone. It was a name, or half of one. E-V-O-S. The rest was obscured. She stared at it for a long time. The sea could take things, but it rarely returned them whole. Before she left the site, Lena circled the perimeter of the bluff one last time. A narrow trail snaked along the ridge, half hidden beneath ferns and blackberry vines. She followed it instinctively until she spotted a small shack nestled just inside the trees. Weather-beaten, roof sagging, but smoke rose faintly from a chimney. She approached cautiously, knocked once on the warped doorframe. An older man answered, boots unlaced, eyes wary but not surprised. He lived alone, had for decades, claimed not to know much. But when Lena mentioned the deaths, the skiff, and the markers, his posture changed. He said strange things had always happened around Kiln Bay. Said people who spent too much time on the water sometimes came back different, if they came back at all. He remembered a man who used to fish out there, tall, dark hair, didn't age like the rest of them. The man was careful not to give a name, claimed he couldn't remember, but Lena saw something tighten in his jaw when she described the pattern of the deaths. She asked if anyone had been up here recently. He hesitated, then nodded once, said there'd been someone, quiet, watching from the trees, didn't speak. Lena didn't press further. She knew fear when she saw it. She returned to her mother's home just after dark. The wind had picked up and the trees along the back fence swayed like they were trying to whisper through the glass. Inside, the house was silent, but something was off. The lock turned too easily. The lights flickered once when she flipped the switch. In the hallway, a thin trail of salt dust lined the baseboards. She crouched beside it, ran a gloved hand through the grains. They'd been placed, not spilled. In the bedroom, the trunk she'd searched days earlier sat with its lid slightly ajar. Inside, the coat was still there, but the photo she'd left tucked beneath it was gone. She stood slowly. At the front window, the curtains had been drawn shut, but one panel had shifted just slightly, as though someone had stood behind it, watching the street. She moved to the window, pulled the curtain back. Nothing. The street was empty, but across the road, near the tree line, something moved. A figure, tall, still, facing the house. She blinked and they were gone. The next morning, Lena sat at her kitchen table, the locket open in front of her. The photo inside, the man with the sharp eyes and the storm-lined coat, felt heavier now, like it carried more weight than its size should allow. She studied his face, trying to force recognition. The same feeling gnawed at her, the same half-memory, as if she should know him but couldn't. She turned the photo over. Blank. No notes, no markings. Before she could dive deeper, her phone buzzed. Sergeant Baker. He informed her there'd been a development. A man had been picked up near the shoreline the night after Marla's death, a drifter picked up near Coral Hill. He'd been seen loitering near the old inlet, where the body had washed up. Witnesses described him as unkempt, erratic, carrying a bundle of what looked like fishing gear or maybe something heavier. Baker didn't sound convinced, but he needed Lena to know. They were holding the man for questioning. Lena didn't wait for an official request. The man sat hunched at the small table, hands stuffed into the sleeves of a tattered jacket, eyes flicking nervously between the floor and the door. His face was drawn and wind-chapped, the look of someone who was used to sleeping rough. Lena entered the room with her badge clipped visibly, but said nothing at first. She dropped a thin file onto the table and pulled a chair opposite him, letting the scrape of the metal legs on the tile stretch the tension thin. She began asking questions, standard at first. Where he had been, why he was near the shoreline that night, whether he had seen anything unusual. The man answered haltingly, his words stumbling over themselves. Said he was gathering driftwood. Said he didn't see anything. Said he didn't know the woman who died. Lena pressed harder, not with shouts, but with the kind of intensity that made the room feel smaller. Asked if he had followed Lena Voss. Asked if he had waited for her by the cliffs. Asked why he kept glancing toward the mirror, like he was hiding something. The man shrank back in his seat, mumbling denials, fear breaking through the grime on his face. Lena leaned forward, voice low, sharp, relentless. It wasn't professionalism anymore. It was personal. For a few seconds, the man seemed close to breaking, whether from guilt or fear, she couldn't tell. And then Baker opened the door, stepping halfway into the room. Not a word spoken, just a silent reminder. Lena sat back slowly, realizing how tightly her hands were clenched. She pushed off from the table without another glance at the man and walked out into the hallway. Baker followed but said nothing. The message was clear enough. Not like this. Not if she wanted to find the real truth. That night, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, Lena took the locket apart. Tiny screws, delicate hinges. Inside the metal casing, wedged between the photo and the backing, she found something else. A sliver of paper. A name. Elias Voss. Scrawled in a woman's careful hand. Below it, a date. 1927. And beneath the date, faint, almost invisible, 2 words scratched in anger and fear. He returned. The bar had been shuttered for decades, though the rusted sign above the door still read, "The Tide's In." It sat on a sloping curve of the coast where the cliffs ran close to the water. Storm damage had hollowed it out. Salt and time had stripped the paint. A set of warped stairs led down to the wrecked service entrance, half buried under seagrass and blown sand. The address had come up from an old receipt, tucked into one of the case files Lena had dug out from the archives. It matched a victim's last known whereabouts in 1947, supposedly unrelated to her death, but Lena didn't believe in coincidences anymore. The inside of the building was hushed, not quiet, suppressed, like the air itself didn't want to move. Broken stools lay scattered across the floor. Dust blanketed the bar. The back wall was covered in old fishing licenses, mottled with mold. Her flashlight swept over sea charts tacked to the wall, a broken radio receiver, a cracked mirror. In one corner, she found a crawl space, small, narrow, and braced with rotting beams. She crouched. Inside was a stack of weather-damaged folders, wrapped in twine and tucked behind loose bricks. Old notes, articles, photos. Someone had been documenting the deaths, keeping track of the names. Every 2 decades, always women. And then, at the bottom of the pile, a photograph. Not printed, developed by hand, grainy and faint. A man standing near the boat launch, unaged. Same coat, same face. Lena started to turn, but she wasn't alone. The impact came without sound, a blur in the periphery, a flash of motion through the beam of her light. She was thrown back hard, skull grazing a beam, knees buckling. Her flashlight skittered across the floor. She scrambled. Something moved in the dark, impossibly fast. She kicked out, caught nothing. Another blow landed, low, meant to disorient, not kill. She caught a glimpse, then boots soaked with salt water, a silhouette half lit, breathing hard but controlled. Hands wrapped around her throat, not to choke, but to pin, hold, assess. And then, just as suddenly, black. Someone found her. An angler passing by with a flashlight had seen her car and checked the building. He called it in. Paramedics arrived first, then Baker, then 2 deputies. Lena was pale, blood matted into her hairline, bruising along her collar, conscious but only barely. The place had been torn apart, the documents gone, the photo missing. She was taken to the hospital under light sedation. Baker stood outside her room, jaw tight, knuckles white around a styrofoam cup. He told the deputies to sweep the building again, to keep it off the books for now. He knew what this was. He didn't know who. But Lena was getting close, and someone had tried to stop her. After a day under hospital supervision, Lena insisted on being discharged. Baker didn't argue. He simply handed her the case updates, silent and grim. The two previous suspects had been re-interviewed. The drifter they picked up after her mother's death had airtight alibis, stretching back days before the incident. His erratic behavior had been fear, not guilt. He'd seen something moving along the cliffs, but hadn't dared report it properly, terrified of being tied to the deaths. The old man at Kiln Bay had a similar story. Hadn't left the property in weeks. Deputies found him still tending his traps when they arrived. No salt in his house, no weapons, no signs of travel. Neither of them fit. Both were survivors, not predators. And both had described seeing a tall figure, unmoving, near the waterline, watching. Not walking, just watching. 2 days after her attack, Lena tracked down another link, this time through one of the archive files tied to the 1947 case. The victim's niece still lived in the area, 2 counties inland. Her name was Isla Raines, mid-50s, soft-spoken on the phone, reluctant but willing to meet. Her house sat on the edge of a dry riverbed, surrounded by pine scrub and fields gone to seed. Inside, it smelled faintly of rain and dust. Isla didn't remember her aunt, born years after her death, but she'd grown up hearing the stories, whispers about a family curse, about the sea taking what it wanted and giving nothing back. When Lena asked about personal effects, Isla hesitated, then led her to an old wooden box in the back room. Inside were a few brittle photographs, most of them family gatherings, blurred and overexposed, but tucked at the bottom was a similar photo, a man. Same features, same storm-worn coat, same sharp, unaged eyes. Lena felt the blood drain from her fingers. She didn't need to ask where the photo had come from. Isla said her aunt had carried it everywhere after her husband vanished. Her mother said her sister used to sit by the window, staring at the sea, whispering his name under her breath. After she lost him, she changed. Her love for him was a spell. Lena drove back to the coast under a sky weighed down with clouds. The truth was crystallizing in her mind. Every strange report, every missing body, every story half whispered at the edge of town. It had always been pointing back to one man, Elias Voss, her father. Not drowned, not lost, preserved, changed. It was after midnight when Lena arrived back at her mother's house. But the second Lena stepped inside, the house felt wrong. It felt heavy, expectant. She moved carefully through the front hall, senses sharp, the faint creak of the floorboards under her boots the only sound. Then she saw him, standing in the kitchen. The same coat, the same face from the locket, unaged. Her breath caught, muscles tensing. Only then did she draw her weapon, leveling it with both hands. He turned slowly, made no move toward her. His voice was calm, familiar in a way that made her stomach twist. He spoke of the sea, of 1927, how something had risen in the tide. A choice, he called it. A chance to live, but not unchanged. The ritual was part of the agreement. Every so often, a life for a life. Silence for silence. He said her mother had been different, that Marla had tried to resist the tide's pull after she realized what he was. But love was a weakness. It had nearly broken the cycle. He said Lena's existence was a mistake, a crack in the system that had to be sealed. She raised her radio to call it in. He moved faster than she could react. The cloth was pressed to her mouth and nose. The chemical bite filled her throat. She struggled, twisting, but her strength faded fast. The last thing she saw was his face, impossibly sad, impossibly resigned. She woke to the sound of the water slapping against old pylons. The air smelled of mold, salt, and decaying wood. She was beneath the ruined bar, the tide's end, underneath the rickety frame of the abandoned structure hidden from the cliffs above. The tides licked at the supports, eroding them year by year. The space was a cavern carved by time, half natural, half falling apart. Around her, barnacles glistened under the sickly light of a single oil lamp. Salt lines formed concentric rings in the sand. Elias moved slowly, methodically. He wasn't angry. He was patient. He spoke quietly as he prepared the final elements, told her the ritual was an agreement made in desperation. He hadn't understood what he was agreeing to, only that the alternative had been oblivion. He spoke of her mother in soft tones, how Marla had been the only one who had ever made him hesitate. That was why he had tried to leave, to drown himself instead of continuing. But the sea had brought him back. And now, Lena was here, the offering the tide would finally accept. He approached her, holding a salt-packed cloth, barnacles embedded in it like teeth. His hands were steady. He whispered that it wasn't personal, that it was survival. He leaned close, and Lena moved. She twisted hard, wrenching free from where he'd tied her. Pain lanced up her arms, but she ignored it. The first blow caught him across the jaw, enough to stagger him. The second, driven with everything she had, sent him crashing against a rotted support beam. The ocean surged beneath them, greedy. He lurched toward her again, but the footing gave way. Wood cracked, water sprayed. Lena struck once more, driving him back. His foot slipped, his balance went, and then he fell into the surf below. The current dragged him outward in seconds, toward the rocks and the black pull of the deep water beyond. She watched, gasping, bleeding, arms trembling, but he didn't surface. Not this time. The sea closed over him without a ripple. By dawn, deputies moved quietly through the property, cordoning off the remnants of the ruined bar. Lena was already outside, sitting on the rocks above the tide. Her face was bloodied, eyes blank, wrists red and raw. Baker was the first to reach her. He didn't ask questions. He just sat beside her until the medics arrived. The body was never recovered. No official report could cover what had happened. No official report would try. Just a case that would quietly close. But Lena knew, and so did the sea. The tide was going out, and for the first time in a century, it didn't take anything with it. Weeks later, the shoreline looked no different. The cliffs still rose like broken teeth against the sky. The tides still rolled and receded, careless, endless. Lena stood along the water's edge, boots planted firm in the wet sand. The morning was heavy with mist, blurring the horizon into a dull smear of gray and silver. She hadn't come for ceremony. She hadn't come for closure. There was none to be had. She simply stood there, hands deep in her coat pockets, feeling the locket pressing against her palm, the one thing she hadn't surrendered to the tide. The town had moved on the way small towns always did, quietly, without questions. No one spoke of the deaths anymore. No one asked about Elias Voss. Not to her, not out loud. The ruins of the tide's inn were already being swallowed by erosion. The sea was taking back what had always belonged to it. Lena stared at the water for a long time, breathing in the salt and damp and cold. And in the spaces between the crashing waves, she thought she heard something else. Not a sound, not a voice, an invitation. Something patient, something ancient, waiting. She closed her eyes, feeling the tide pull a little closer around her boots, soft and persistent. When she opened them again, the ocean stretched before her, steady, familiar, endless, waiting for an answer. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel. Give it a like, a comment, and maybe a share. But if you didn't like the story, maybe share it with someone you don't like. In any case, I'm glad you stuck around to the end.